Classical polytheism. So in our previous installment yesterday, we looked at the basics of the polytheistic system and how polytheistic religion came into existence. Now we're going to take a little bit of a second look at this entire institution of polytheism, and we're going to look at some of the common themes and basic principles of polytheistic religion. Let's begin. Regional deities. This is one very interesting aspect of polytheism, which often blows the absolute mind of most of us, because most of us grew up either as atheists or as monotheists, either believing in no gods or believing in one God. And those who tend to believe in a single God view that God in a more universal context, right? If there's one God, then that God cares for everything. The entire world is under the dominion of that God. And all the people of the world are answerable and have value in the eyes of that God. In a polytheistic religion, that's not necessarily the case. For polytheists, gods and goddesses were much more national or regional, and deities would often be assigned as patrons of a city or a country. So, for example, Athena was the patron goddess of Athens. So, if you were in Athens, you better be worshiping Athena, because she was seen as the goddess who had Athens' best interest at heart. Now, conversely, if you're in Lacedaemon, the country where Sparta was located, you're not going to be praying to Athena, because Athena don't care about Lacedaemon. Athena cares about Athens. You're going to be worshiping Ares, the god of war, because Ares cares more about Lacedaemon. And if you're in the Isle of Lesbos, then you have different gods you're worshiping, or etc. So, even within the same pantheon, like the Greeks, there was still this sense that certain gods and goddesses played favorites or were only important to certain regions. And that also becomes the case when we look at laws. So, for example, an empire's well-being was often seen as being tied to the goodwill of its gods. So there were Roman laws that actually stated that most subjects, there were exceptions made for a select few, had to worship the Roman triad. Those were the three most important Roman gods: Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. And as a result of this, it was law. You had to worship these three gods. And the reason why was, as far as the Romans were concerned, even though the Romans would let their subjects worship as many different gods as they liked, as far as they were concerned, yeah, you can go and pray to an Egyptian god or a Greek god, but that Egyptian god or that Greek god isn't going to care about the welfare of Rome, right? Osiris don't care about Rome. Zeus doesn't care about Rome. Who cares about Rome? Jupiter cares about Rome. Juno cares about Rome. Minerva cares about Rome. So those are the people, those are the deities that they felt had to be worshipped, because those were the deities that actually cared about the welfare of the empire. So they wanted to make sure that every citizen was offering sacrifices, in other words, doing their due diligence to keep that god appeased, so that Rome would continue to flourish. That's not really the way people look at deities now, so it's an important mindset to keep in mind when you're looking at classical polytheism. Now, classical polytheism took a lot of detail when dealing with the afterlife. Unlike our early Paleolithic religions, where we know very little about what they thought of an afterlife, other than that they believed there was one, here we get very important details about the nature of the afterlife. So one important idea is that the dead dwelt in the underworld. And the underworld, or land of the dead, was not the place where the gods lived. So it's not like how a lot of modern monotheists think of, heaven, and the good folks go up to be with God in heaven. That's not the way that polytheists are looking at it. The gods live in a different location than where the mortal dead are going to go. That was just the way it was. So, in a classical polytheistic mindset, the underworld is then further divided based upon the life one lived. So, in most of these cultures, there was an idea that you'd have a specific part of the underworld that was for the extra righteous, the heroes, the really, really good people. And then you'd have then you have a place for like the folks who were neither good nor bad, sort of the morally neutral kind of folks. And then you'd have another location for the really bad folks. And based on the life you lived, that determined which part of the underworld your soul was going to. And generally, underworlds worked on the kind of an idea of rewards for righteousness, punishments for sin. If you were a good person in life, you were going to enjoy a good afterlife. And if you were a bad person in life, you were going to have a terrible afterlife. Now, one other interesting detail, which is incredibly different from a lot of modern religions, is the idea that proper burial was very important to your eternal rest. So, even though almost all religions have some concept of burial being important, to the ancient folks, a proper burial was essential to your actual rest. So there are many descriptions in Greek myths, for example, of particularly with Stygius, I think it was, who was not or who claimed he was not properly buried and could not find rest. That kind of idea, which if you were not buried properly, you could be in for trouble. So, for example, in ancient Greece, it was believed that when you reached the underworld, you had to be ferried across the river Styx by the ferryman Charon, the ferryman of the dead, and that if you were going to make this voyage, you had to have a coin to pay him with. Well, now part of a ritual in burial was that the dead would be buried with a coin under their tongue, and that was supposed to be the coin they would use to pay the ferryman. If you were buried without that coin, it was believed your soul would have to wait a year on the banks of the river Styx before you could face your judgment, because you did not have the money to pay the ferryman. So I think in Egyptian rites this even goes further, because organs like the heart, for example, were considered part of the soul. And so if you were not properly buried, and your heart was not properly preserved, it risked your mortal soul. That's very important when understanding the afterlife for ancient people. So we're going to continue with the afterlife. So, another interesting detail is that the underworld was seen as located beneath the ground. So, unlike modern conceptualizations of an underworld or a hell, where it's kind of held the idea that it's like another world, it's another plane of existence, we as individual mortals are not thought to be able to go there and come back. That's how most people think of a hell or a heaven. It's not like, oh, I'm going to dig in the ground, and if I dig too deep, I'm going to accidentally dig into hell. No. But for the ancient people, that was very much the way they thought of the underworld. That you basically could dig into the underworld. If you journeyed down into the ground, you could reach it. There's a famous ancient Greek measurement where they used to say that if an anvil fell from the top of Mount Olympus, it would take 11 days to hit the earth. Beneath the earth, you would land in the main body of the underworld, Hades. And then beneath that was Tartarus, the flaming pit, where the punished titans and the worst souls were usually sent. And it was believed that Tartarus was another 11-day anvil fall from the main body of Hades. So to them, this was very much a matter of physical direction. Theoretically, you could dig down to Tartarus if you were desperate. Not sure why you'd want to go down there, but if you were of the mind to do so, you could do so. And many of these societies contain stories of mortals visiting the underworld and then returning. So, for example, Hercules, for the 12th labor assigned to Hercules, he had to retrieve the mighty three-headed dog Cerberus from the underworld and bring it back. So he went down, beat the dog over the head, he grabbed this three-headed dog, and he brought it back up. Orpheus is another one from Greek mythology, where Orpheus was a poet and a singer whose wife died, and he wants to bring her back with him, so he goes down into the underworld and in an attempt to bring her back. Ultimately, this fails for him, but he does go down there as a mortal man. Now, in Egyptian theology, we find the idea of a second death. Now, only in Egyptian polytheism do we get this detail about the afterlife. And it was believed that it occurred when one was forgotten. So if your memory was entirely erased from this world, then you suffered what was called the second death. A similar fate was assigned to those whose heart was eaten by Ammit. So Ammit, which is the creature which you see on the right-hand side of the screen, Ammit was a creature, a divine, demonic kind of beast that contained the head of a crocodile, the upper body of a lion, and the lower body of a hippopotamus. And the Egyptians believed that when someone died, their heart, which was seen as the main thinking organ of the body and representative of the soul, would be weighed against the feather of truth, with the gods Anubis and Ibis, and the ibis-headed god, presiding over it. And it was, I think, Thoth. Thoth was the ibis-headed god. And so Anubis and Thoth would preside over this scale where the deceased heart would be weighed against the feather of truth. And if it was found to be light, that is to say, if it was found to be righteous, then the dead would be allowed to go forward into the underworld and into the paradise where Osiris had built for them. If not, if it was found to be heavy with sin, then it was believed that their heart was then fed to this beast called Ammit, which would devour their heart. And as a result, their soul would be left to wander without rest, and they were considered to have died a second death. So that's that. Now, children of the gods. So this is very interesting. So, unlike many of our conceptions of a god, where a god is held to be a continuous, eternal thing that always existed and always will exist, in Greek and other polytheistic conceptions, gods and goddesses were born. They had children. They were children at some point. They were the offspring of other deities or other beings having relations. And we see a lot of relations, sexual relations, in these various polytheistic religions, either between gods and goddesses, so gods and goddesses having children that were other gods and goddesses, or between deities, either a god or a goddess, and a mortal, a human being. So, for example, this idea was so widespread that in Greece, several noble families claimed their right to rule by claiming they were descendants of Zeus. Now, it was generally held that the offspring of these unions in different mythologies and different religions of polytheism would take different forms. So, for example, one common one is demigods. That's to say, individuals that are held to be half human and half divine. So think Heracles in the Greek tradition, or Hercules in the Roman tradition, who was held to be half god and half man. His father was Zeus, and his mother was a mortal woman. Or Gilgamesh, from the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, who somehow was actually 2/3 god and 1/3 man. Don't ask me mathematically how that one works out, but that's what the epic says. So, go with it. Now, despite this, it should also be remembered that different cultures, different polytheistic religions, are going to observe different rules for this. So, for example, in Egypt, the pharaohs were classified as gods, even though they themselves were the